gentlemen. Welcome to the October edition of the Local History Guild. My name is Mike Dyer. I'm your host this evening. I'm the curator of maritime history here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and it's going to be a great evening. We have a bona fide, real deal, like total expert on clocks and clockmaking and timekeeping and the history of horology. Bob Frishman here with us this evening. Bob, I looked up Bob's biography, and it's really pretty extraordinary and extensive. You know, a fellow, Silver Star Fellow, the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, chairman of the Time Symposium Committee. He's organized conferences for Winterthur, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Henry Ford Museum, the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. I believe you spoke here at the Whaling Museum once upon a time, didn't you, Bob?
I did, yeah, and nobody fell asleep, as I recall.
Nobody fell asleep, but did you have a cuckoo clock or anything just in case?
A taser.
So, I mean, this biography just goes on and on and on. You know, Carissa, our technical services person, said, you know, how many lectures has Bob given? And I started counting, and I lost count around 80, but Bob claims it's over 100. And so I believe him. We met at the Dublin seminar this past summer. It was a Dublin seminar for New England Folklife out in historic Deerfield. Very, very nice. It was good. I thought it was good, didn't you, Bob?
Oh yeah, especially my part.
Especially. It was a nice seminar, and I talked about the Morse Twist Drill and Machine Company here in New Bedford, and then Bob gave a talk on New England's clock and watchmakers tools at the Dublin seminar. So this evening we have Bob Frishman with us, timekeeping and clockmaking in early New England. This is a presentation that Mr. Frishman is giving, so we'll forego the interruptions and question asking that's our normal format, and be a bit more civilized about the whole thing and ask the questions at the end. So, Bob Frishman.
Great, thank you. Let's see, there we are. I'm just getting this screen sharing thing done. Let's see, we'll make it so that everybody really likes this. All right, that looks the way I wanted it to look. Great, thank you, Mike. It was a great introduction. I love going to the Whaling Museum, and I'm sorry that I'm not there speaking to a crowd, but this is second best, and I have been there a few times, but I'd love to come back too. So I will, I'm sure I'll do that soon. This is obviously my title slide, just to ease you into it. Probably a lot of you are familiar with this scene of early New Bedford, and it's perfect for a way to start in talking about tonight's subject, which is timekeeping and timekeepers in your town there. I have a larger view of this scene because off on the right you see a clockmaker's, watchmaker's trade sign hanging over a window there. And I've noted that image, which probably a lot of you know was originally painted by William A. Wall, an artist, was also a watch and clockmaker in New Bedford. So he wasn't just an artist. He actually got his hands dirty, not with paint, but with clock oil. And here's an ad of his that's from 1824. So he was responsible for that great print, but also for clock and watch work. And there's an enlargement of it. And we do know that that's Josiah Wood's clock shop that's at an important old intersection in New Bedford. So we see that that watchmaker's sign, and there's another one quite similar to it. These obviously were not working watches or clocks. They were painted wood signs on both sides, because a lot of places, as you know, didn't have addresses back then. People found these tradesmen in stores by looking for the trade signs that they had outside. So there's just a little general overview I should give you first about timekeeping in New England and its origins, because New Bedford obviously was a very important part of New England. I like to show an image of the Mayflower because it raises the question of how many clocks and watches were on the Mayflower, and the answer is 0. They did not have mechanical timekeeping that was good for ocean voyages, that was expensive enough or accurate enough to make inexpensive or accurate enough to make that worthwhile. But they did have sand glasses, which was how they timed the watches on shipboard, because the helmsman, the guy steering the ship, was on duty for 30 minutes, half an hour, and then the next guy came along. And as they did, they turned over this half-hour sand glass. There was often a unfortunate process of called eating sand, where the guy, if it was cold or rainy, he wanted to get back in his bunk, he turned the sand glass over before it was empty. And if they did that often enough, they would actually reverse night and day on board the ship, especially if it was foggy or stormy and they couldn't keep track of where the sun was at a particular time. So when that sand glass flipped over, of course, a lot of you know from maritime timekeeping, or perhaps we're in the Navy, there was bells that rang from 1 to 8 over a 4-hour period, with every half hour the number advancing. This is a Winslow Homer painting, obviously. That's a great one. The Lookout, All's Well, is the title of it. I'll be mentioning Homer a few other times. Obviously, he's relevant here and one of my favorite artists. So here we have a second one too. This is 8 Bells, which this painting lives right here in Andover at the Addison Gallery of Art. So you see them taking the noon sighting, and this would have happened on every ship that was beyond the view of land, and you're out there with no signposts, no GPS. So if you took the noon sighting, you could determine your latitude, which is important, north-south, and eventually with accurate timekeeping or other ways of doing it, you could determine your longitude as well. So you if you were going to Nova Scotia, you didn't end up in Richmond instead. So there's another great early daguerreotype of a sailor holding his sextant. So, these were important, expensive instruments, and sometimes your life depended on accurate use of them and them being accurate instruments among themselves. Of course, on land, the way that everybody determined the time was by using a sundial, which is great when the sun is shining. And up until really about 125 years ago, that still was the basic arbiter wherever you were. That's how people set their watches and clocks, was by the sundial. We have a nice early one here that's at the Peabody Essex Museum. As you can see, it was made in 1630. Certainly longer ago than that, actually going back to ancient Egypt. The shadow that the sun cast on a gnomon or a stick was how you saw how the time was progressing in your area. And there's another great view of a sundial, a garden sundial. This is at Beauport in Gloucester, the great early house owned by Historic New England. And you see, you can get pretty accurate with that gnomon shining onto the hours indicated on the bed of the sundial. The trouble is that sun time is not clock time. It varies, and you need an equation of time chart like this one that appeared in one of Ben Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanacs, because everybody needed them if they were using their sundial to set their clocks and watches. There's only 4 times a year when the sun's time coincides with clock or watch time. Otherwise, you have to add or subtract minutes based on what the date is over the entire year. And these kinds of charts were quite common. They were inside of pocket watch cases, inside of grandfather clock doors. So you could make that conversion if you needed to. For most people, it didn't matter. The rooster crowed, you got up, you got hungry, you ate. But if you needed to know specifically the time for setting your watch or clock, you needed this equation of time. There were also this version of a sundial called a noon gun. And if this were aligned correctly, the sun would shine at noon directly onto the touch hole of the cannon and set off a charge. And these were recorded as being on the tops of castle walls in Europe. And they were quite dramatic. And you see that the latitude is notated there quite specifically. And that's another issue about sundials. They only work correctly when they're created specifically for the latitude. You'll be off by quite a bit if you use a sundial for one latitude in another one. So they're not universal. Ben Franklin, I just mentioned with Poor Richard's Almanac, also had a great idea for a very large sundial, which would alert your neighbors to the time too. were actually the plan, and this was, of course, a parody, which was reprinted several times too, but he was saying that you could align 78 guns, preferably 32-pounders, in a circle, and as the sun went around and a magnifier hit those touch holes every hour, one of those 32-pounders would blast, and everybody within a 10-mile radius or something would know what time it was. I don't think anybody ever attempted to create this kind of sundial, but he was having fun with it. But Ben Franklin, more practically, was the designer of the first American currency when we were, after we'd announced our independence. This is a Fugio dollar. Fugio is Latin for time flies or passes. And you see there's sundial imagery on here because the sundial was an icon, essentially, for hard work. And that's what mind your business means. He's not saying mind your own business, don't be nosy. He's saying, let's all get to work. Let's all work hard because we got a country to build. We got a British army to defend ourselves against. So the sundial has substantial as iconic relevance, as well as just telling us the time. One more sundial I have that's relevant to a place near you. This is Roger Williams arriving in Providence, Rhode Island, and Roger Williams' pocket sundial still exists. It's at the Historical Society of Rhode Island, and he would have carried this. And, within some element of accuracy, he could have determined his time. And if he was arranging to do things at a specific time, he had the instrument in his pocket that enabled him to do this. Of course, this is a scene that most of you are probably familiar with, the Paul Revere engraving of the Boston Massacre. When I talk about the American Revolution and timekeeping, which was the subject of last year's symposium I created in Philadelphia, we talk a lot about this image. You probably already know that it's propaganda, that it didn't really happen like this. But I focus on this because this image is a twofer. It has two timepieces in it. On the left back there, you see the diamond-shaped dial on the old brick church. But directly in front of us is a wall-mounted sundial, and there's a close-up of it because sundials were the arbiters of time, and as long as the sun was shining, you'd glance up at the pediment of this building and see the shadow and know what time it was from this building mounted sundial. And you still see those on buildings in Europe. A lot of cathedrals or old town halls and all would have a building mounted sundial as well. Another issue to keep in mind is that it wasn't until 1883 that we had standard time in America. So every town determined its noon for when the sun was directly overhead. And this is an interesting chart. You see my little purple lines there that I've noted the time at New Bedford and in Providence when it was exactly noon in Boston. And you see that they were off by a few minutes, again, because of their east-west position. But you see other places were certainly much farther off from noon. And this, of course, was a nightmare once train travel became prevalent, because you never knew what time it was or which place the railroad company was based on, and train schedules were the size of the Manhattan phone book. And finally, we got in 1883, the day of two noons, when standard time with our 4 time zones across the country was imposed, and we didn't have more than 700 local time zones anymore. This is a nice old view of Liberty Hall in New Bedford. And this sort of makes the point that some of the first clocks were public clocks in the steeples of towns and cities. They knew that they had arrived at a certain level of sophistication and affluence and size when they could afford to put a public clock up inside the tower. And of course, if you weren't within sight of the dials, you probably were within hearing range of the bells, which would travel much further. And you could know if the town was telling you both the time or whether there was some fire or emergency that the bells were also announcing. Inside those towers were old machines that looked kind of like this. This one's in Newport at their historical society, Newport, Rhode Island. And a few of the parts are missing here, but these were big iron machines, often built by blacksmiths before clockmakers were around here. And these big machines were powered by weights hanging from those drums that you see there too. And these were ticking machines that, if they were adjusted correctly, would keep the correct time up there in the towers of the church. And this was important for already things were happening on specific times. Here's a New Bedford advertisement from the early 1800s showing that the stagecoach was going to leave for Boston at 9 o'clock. So not everybody had a clocker and watch, but if that timepiece up in this tower was keeping time, they would know that it was about time for that stagecoach to head off to Boston. As individuals became more affluent, they were able to afford having long case clocks or tall clocks in their homes. And those were also indications that a family had reached, not just the city or a town, but a family had reached a certain level of sophistication and affluence in order to do this. This is a painting by Robert Peckham, who was a little bit better, Deacon Robert Peckham, early 1800s again, showing his family, the Peckham-Sawyer family, based in Bolton, Mass. And this is one of those posthumous paintings, because the little girl there on the that I'm circling here, little Elizabeth, had died about 3 months before this painting was executed. And this was an homage to her, to sort of tell her spirit and the rest of the family that that little Elizabeth was still alive in the minds and the hearts of the family. Of course, there were other tall clocks already around this time. And the last time I was at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, I took a couple of pictures of great ones that you have on display here, including this 18th century Dutch clock that's standing there, and this lovely Japan case clock as well, an 18th century that's standing in your galleries also. These were not made in Asia, but there was the whole appreciation of Asian, Japanese, Chinese art and aesthetics that were applied mostly by London. There were some Boston Japanners, but most of this work was done in London by Japanners who produced these beautiful Asian motif cases. Most of them now are wrecks. All the stuff falls off and they're ugly to look at. But this one is in beautiful condition, and I'm happy to look at it. We can start looking at some local clockmakers too in the New Bedford area. And just so I don't start mixing the names up, yeah, this is Josiah Wood, whose shop we mentioned a minute ago. There's this lovely miniature portrait of Josiah Wood. And there's one of the Josiah Woods that's clocks that's in your museum as well. It's great for you to have local examples, not just Japanned ones from London, but to have local makers as well. There's a full view of the clock as well. And one of the principal reference books for me learning about the specifics of American clock and watchmakers is this great thick book this is actually the second edition of it, where they added another several thousand names. And here's the entry for Josiah Wood. So, everything the authors of that book could find out about them, they included in these entries. Some are long, some are short for obvious reasons, but this is a great sort of snapshot view of his career as a New Bedford watchmaker and clockmaker. If you didn't think there were too many of them in New Bedford, here is another section of the book where they organize these clock and watchmakers by location. And you see the New Bedford list is pretty long. And we're not talking up until the year 2012. This is up until about the middle of the 19th century. So there were certainly plenty of them. And there needed to be plenty of them because clocks and watches needed service quite regularly. These guys were rarely mass producing or producing at all brand new clocks and watches. Those were expensive, rare. They took a long time to make. Mostly they were servicing the clocks and watches in existence because of the dusty, smoky, dirty, rough and tumble environments. Those timepieces needed a lot of attention. And most towns up until quartz watchmaking almost would support 1, 2, 3 watchmakers because everybody's mechanical watch needed to be serviced pretty regularly. So I did find some Josiah Wood advertisements in early newspapers. I have these dates if you want them. Some of them, the date is on there, as you see, in 1801. So here you are, that he's announcing in 1801 that he's set up there near Four Corners, and he also has watches for sale. Here we have Josiah Wood, and here we're seeing the proof that he was not just a watch and clockmaker, because it was tough to make a living, especially that early, just being in that trade, because there wasn't enough business usually, especially if he had competition. So he definitely was in the dry goods business as well, as we'll see also. And you see here, he's got a nice long announcement where he's talking about all the fabrics and things that he's just gotten in from London. He's got tea and tablespoons, salt spoons, all that kind of stuff. And of course, way down at the bottom, yes, he's got some English and French watches and chains and all too. But he was definitely way more than a guy that just had a few clocks ticking on his shop shelves. Here we see another one. He's got a large assortment of English and French goods, all kinds of things. And finally, down at the bottom, oh yeah, and by the way, I've got some silver watches too, in addition to Leghorn bonnets, which I'm sure all of you in New Bedford are still wearing on special occasions. Just to mention those silver watches, this is an example of what we'd be talking about. This is an English watch from the late 18th century that I used to own. They were in pair cases, essentially a pair of silver cases that protected the watch from some of that dust and soot. And here's the movement of that watch. And the interesting thing, the reason I bought it when I could, is that you see the watchmaker's name is Alexander Hamilton. This is not our Alexander Hamilton, but it was one in London with that famous name. So it was great to have that. And I not long ago sold that watch to a Revolutionary War reenactor, because he was thrilled too to have a pocket watch with Alexander Hamilton's name on it. And if you're lucky, when you buy a pair case watch like that, it has a watch paper inside. These were printed up by the watchmakers, either to say that they sold it or to say that they had serviced it at a time and remind the owner that this is where they could return to have it serviced in the future. Sometimes there's a whole stack of them you find in there, because every time the watch was serviced, another watch paper would be put inside. And this also shows that Josiah Wood had some company in his house, because this piano instructor and servicer actually had taken a room in the house of Josiah Wood's house. So maybe he had some musical accompaniment when he was doing his work or trying to get to sleep at night as well. So let's see. Now let's see. Yeah, here's we've just, this is Stephen Tabor. Sorry, my screen is blocking the name up top. So now we're moving to another very important watchmaker and clockmaker. And he's announcing that he was an apprentice to Aaron Willard, one of the most famous, both members of the Willard family of clockmakers and most famous New England clockmaker in general. A lot of Willard clocks are out there. A lot of Willard clocks are out there that the Willards never made too. So you need to be careful if you're spending a lot of money on one. But Stephen Tabor's clocks are much rarer. But here he is announcing that he's that in 1799 that he's already in business and where that business is. And of course, you have a nice Tabor clock there in your museum as well. There's a full view of it with a white painted dial and a lunar indicator up top there as well. This is a great picture of one of his shelf clocks as well. These are much rarer. The design, the Willards made a lot of these too. They're sort of made to look like English bracket clocks, which were spring wound. But in this case, we weren't that good at making mainsprings, and we needed weight powered clocks instead. So you needed a space for the weight to descend inside the case. So this is kind of a bracket clock looking like it's on top of a pedestal, but it's actually made to encompass both the descending weight and the swinging pendulum that's happening inside. So there's some information about Stephen Tabor that's from one of my clock and watch magazines. There's a little biography there too. And I believe this was by a descendant who sent in information about it. So he's saying that he has Tabor's first tall clay clock. And he's also making the point, again, as I was saying earlier, that Tabor was not sitting there cranking out 10 clocks a month. In fact, this is making it look like he made 3 clocks in 3 years, and he used them to pay for his room and board when he was there. Again, most of the time he was fixing, repairing, and perhaps even doing other things. So here is a dual ad where Josiah Wood is announcing something below, and Sylvester Child is another guy in business too. As you see in Fairhaven, right near there in that year as well. And you see that Wood is now saying that he has taken over the shop of Alanson Gooding, who is another of your clockmakers and watchmakers down there. And there is an Alanson Gooding shelf clock too, with that similar design of a bracket clock on top of a pedestal. You see this one was owned and advertised by Delaney Antique Clocks. It's a place that has a few hundred antique clocks. If you're shopping, this will be a way to look at a lot of them at once. So here is
Nice.
this is Bailey, right? And his picture is in that Harbor and Home book that that's an important reference book for your furniture and your clocks. So he was an important one in New Bedford too, and we're fortunate to have watch paper examples from him. So if he worked on a watch, he would have put this little disc of paper inside there. Here is his entry in that big reference book I told you about that talks about his experience there and then his eventual moving out. So here he is. He's telling people that he's opening his shop there and where it is, and then formerly occupied by Almy and Wall. And this was the wall that painted that view, early view of New Bedford as well, just to reference back to that. So you see all the kinds of work that he's advertising he's doing, as well as trying to get some old silver too, which he's offering cash for. And now we see that he's moved to a different shop, and but still offering the same kinds of services and products. He's also making and selling instruments for surveyors, as you see down there at the bottom. And often those trades were handled by the same person. If they could do watchmaking, they probably could also make scientific instruments or surveying instruments as well. And of course, those watches often were planted in these watch hutches, like you have a nice display of there at the museum. So, and essentially it turned your watch into a clock, a bedside clock or a desk clock. If you didn't have it in your pocket and you were staying put for a while, you could put your watch in one of these lovely watch hutches instead of having it laying around and possibly getting knocked off the desk or the nightstand too. John Bailey had certainly a sad history towards the end, because he was an abolitionist of the most fervent variety, and not quiet about it. And a lot of his customers were not so keen on abolition. They relied on the slave trade. They relied on cotton, and it wasn't good for business either for them or for John Bailey for him to be so adamant about abolition. And eventually he was forced out of town and moved to Lynn, Massachusetts, where he continued his jobs. But you see that one of the things that he did, and this ad demonstrates it, not only is he liquidating his whole inventory here too, but he serviced ship's chronometers, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. But he rated them, which means he made sure they were accurate, and he sold them and serviced them there too. And in this case, he's also disposing of his instruments that were used for highly precise time determination in order to rate those chronometers. You couldn't use a sundial for that. You see your transit instrument, actually a transit telescope that would view when stars were passing certain places, and there you could really zero in on the most accurate time measurements, way better again than a sundial. So here's the guy who probably was helped kick Bailey out of town. This is the next guy, and again, his name is covered up here, but I have it below. Maybe you're seeing his name here too, but Amos Bates in 1839, after Bailey had already been booted out and had to move up to Lynn, Mass. You see, he's taking it on, and he's also claiming that he can work on chronometers as well. And this, of course, was important with all the ships coming and going in New Bedford. Those captains needed their chronometers to make sure that they ended up where they wanted and didn't end up on the rocks. It's interesting that he mentions Mr. Frodsham because that was a famous London maker of chronometers. He has a little problem spelling Frodshem's name down below where he repeats it, but the name, I assure you, is spelled correctly up above. And there's an example of a Frodsham chronometer. These, a lot of you, I hope, have read the book Longitude by David Sobel, talking about John Harrison's ability to prove that accurate timekeeping on shipboard was possible. And that eventually John Harrison didn't make chronometers that look like this, but this is what the design essentially morphed into. And this is what marine chronometers look like for the next 150 years, essentially, where they could be accurate within a few seconds a month, which was adequate for determining your longitude. If they were inaccurate much more than that, you were off by miles and it was useless to be using it. So it was very important that they were accurate, but they were probably the most accurate precision machines of their day of any kind of machinery. And this is a nice example by Charles Frodsham. Another company, New York-based Bliss and Creighton, actually placed an ad in the New Bedford newspaper saying that, advertising their chronometers and hoping that people would buy them from them. And here's an example of a Bliss and Creighton, New York chronometer from that same period. I own 3 of these chronometers. I love looking at them, taking them out of their bowls and seeing that they're not particularly complicated, but they're beautifully made, and the things inside them are extremely complicated to make in a way that will keep good time. Of course, if your boat was just traveling along the coast, like this steamboat, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, you didn't need a chronometer. Your clock or pocket watch was good enough because you were inside of land and you'd know where you were most of the time. But if you were on a whaling ship way out there or down there in Fuji or something, you certainly you needed your chronometer in addition to the sextant and other navigational instruments to know where you were. So this is Benjamin Pittman, another local guy, and you see that he's also selling, servicing chronometer sextants and quadrants as a service to the mariners there. And this poor guy, they were not immune to local crime sprees. So this is another watchmaker who had about $20 worth of old silver stolen. It doesn't look like they grabbed a watch, but they took some old silver when they broke into his shop. So there certainly were clocks from New Bedford as well. I talked about the watches and the chronometers being serviced, but there were a few. This is obviously a banjo clock. The design was invented by Simon Willard up in Boston, but others copied it despite his patent, and they were produced in other areas as well. And this is a nice one that's hanging there in your museum. These were, again, sort of iconic New England timekeepers. This is a folk art painting by Joseph Davis. Before we knew his name, we called him the left-handed artist because people determined that he was left-handed. But often you see the banjo clock in these paintings, and it's unclear whether this family actually owned a banjo clock or not. But the itinerant artist would say, do you want me to spruce up this painting, make you look like you've got more money than maybe you have? And sure, maybe they had a banjo clock, maybe they didn't, but it's interesting to speculate about that. Most likely they had a cat like the cute one we see under the table. If you're wondering what's going on behind the dial of those, that's a banjo clock movement. They're all pretty much the same, quite simple. Train of gears. It takes a lot of power from a descending weight, usually 5, 6, 7 pounds, and turns it through a step down series of gears into just enough power to swing that pendulum back and forth for a week. They're called 8-day clocks, meaning you have a little extra if you forget to wind it every Sunday, as is typical. There are the disassembled parts, and it raises the issue of how much clockmaking even guys like Bailey did, because these are pretty complicated. You need specialized equipment mostly to make these kinds of movements. You can't just sit there by a candle with your Bowie knife and produce parts like this that would work in a functioning clock. So Mike was kind enough to mention my talk at the Dublin seminar about tools, and this was my title for that. So I'll just quickly give you a recap of that. This is at the Willard House and Clock Museum in Grafton, Mass. that I encourage you to go to if you haven't. They're the only American clockmaker shop still on its original foundation. And this shows an array of some of the tools there by the window. You always wanted to work by the window to have enough light to do this. There's the scene of the Dublin seminar, the meeting house there in historic Deerfield, a great place to sit and learn about early New England. Clock shops certainly go much farther back. This one is from the 1400s in Europe. But they're doing a similar kind of work that our fellows in New Bedford were doing many years later. There's a nice painting of a guy at work there too, just to give you a sense. It's usually some old bald guy. I don't know where they got that notion from, except that I seem to fit the mold of depictions of old clockmakers. So there's again another bigger view of some of those tools. A lot of hand tools, but again, you needed some specialized tools as well to do this work. And some of those were bought through this tool maker who issued a catalog in the late 1700s in Liverpool, and quite specifically. So again, you weren't required to make your own files or pliers or anything. You could select from hundreds of them that were available through these kinds of tool catalogs. These are screw plates. These were taps and dies essentially for making screws and screw holes, threaded screw holes in your clock movement. So you could buy them in all shapes and configurations to make screws of all different sizes. And this allowed you to standardize the thread so that one screw that you made would fit in the next hole if you mix the screws up. Here's where some small hand vises as well. So again, this is 18th century stuff. So, already by then, and again, it wasn't somebody with a Bowie knife and a candle. These were sophisticated tools, and they needed to be to do this kind of work. This perhaps is one of the most sophisticated. This is a wheel cutting or gear cutting engine, which you needed if you were cutting all those teeth in a clock gear. You couldn't just eyeball it, because when you got around to the 40th or 60th tooth, the odds are if you were eyeballing it, that last tooth was not going to be in the right place. So you needed a machine like this that would index along and cut those teeth in the right way. And this is a close-up of the one that's at the Willard House and Clock Museum there in Grafton. You see the index plate down below, and a little pointer would fit in those holes as you went around, and the different layers of holes would determine how many teeth were cut in that particular gear. And again, you needed this. You couldn't just be a guy out on a farm, with a hammer and a chisel making clocks. You needed sophisticated equipment like this. And if guys like John Bailey were making clock gears, he would have needed something like this. Here's a movement that probably looks almost exactly like was in any of those tall clocks that I showed that are standing there in the New Bedford Museum. Essentially, it looks quite like the banjo clock movement, except this is two machines in one. This has a striking train as well that rings the bell every hour. So you have two sets of gears powered by two weights hanging below it. And there are those parts disassembled. So again, you see these are complicated things that if you don't make them right, the clock has no chance of working. And I've taken apart hundreds of these if they're historically significant. I take pictures like this just to record what the parts look like. But it's quite difficult to see any difference between most of them, because a lot of them were made in England and imported and just signed by local makers, or they were so standardized that nobody's work was particularly distinctive, because if they made it once and it works perfectly, why mess with the sauce? So and this is proof that clockmakers, even here, if they were doing some of the final finishing assembly, could buy blanks of these wheels and parts, which they then would finish once they were here. So you see there's blank gears there. So if they had a gear cutter, they could at least do that, but they didn't have to do that whole other process of brass casting, which again is tricky. You need brass, first of all, and a lot of clockmakers advertised for old brass that they could melt down and make into clock parts. But brass was expensive. The British didn't want us to have it, didn't want us to make it. So if we could get these clock sets, at least we would save some days or weeks of work casting and preparing these parts to make them into the final parts that you see there. And this is another picture of a clock set. These are actually the pinions, those small steel gears on their arbors. And these, again, it would be quite difficult to make. They're made out of steel, which is much harder to work than brass. And if you could buy a nice little packet of a pinion set from England, from John Wyke in Liverpool, you saved yourself days of work, and you increased by many manyfold the odds that the thing's going to work when you put it all together. There's more blanks of the strike things. It's on the left, you see the completed components of a rack and snail striking system, which is virtually universal in the kinds of clocks standing there at the museum. And you see the blanks on the right, which were, rough cast in steel and then could be finished and cut by the clockmaker here. Clock repairs, as I mentioned, that's what most of these guys spent their time doing, had various things that they needed to fix. Occasionally a brass tooth got broken. You see, in this case, the tooth broke, and when I have to do my dental work on these gears, you actually cut out a little dovetail and you insert a new piece of brass and you shape it to the form of the other teeth. Doesn't happen often, but it's if you need to do it, you need to know how to do it. The other thing that happens with clocks is if they run dirty for a long time, they actually chew up the steel. And you would think, well, how come the steel wears? Isn't it the brass that's softer that should wear out? But what happens is the dirt that comes through the air, the dust, is an abrasive. It embeds in the soft brass, and especially if there's dirt or oil there, and creates a file essentially. And then as this steel part turns in that muck of gritty oil, it chews away the steel. So it's counterintuitive in a way, but you end up with these pivots, which is this last part here, being mushroomed like this. This started out as a nice smooth cylinder, and it got chewed away by the action of that. So this would have to be probably turned down in a lathe, and then you have to make the hole that it turns in a little smaller with the bushing in order to make this work properly again. And, people talk with pride, oh, I haven't had this clock serviced in 40 years. It's great. What a miracle. I love it. It's never needed service. But quietly inside that clock, this kind of damage is happening, so that people are surprised and annoyed when they find out that they've destroyed their clock, or at least created serious service issues by just running the clock or oiling it without cleaning. So all you're doing then is lubricating the dirt and making sure that all those gritty particles can go back to work chewing up the steel. So that's an issue. And here's another instance where that dirt gets to work chewing it up. This is one of those pinions, and again, it's steel, and this was interacting with the brass gear, a larger brass gear, but that gear tooth has grit embedded in it, and especially if it's oily grit, it turns 5,000, 20,000 times. It's going to chew these nice grooves into that pinion, and good luck fixing that. There's ways of dealing with it, but it's tricky, and you definitely don't want to see that, because that certainly affects how the clock works, because the teeth are no longer meshing properly with that small steel gear, because it's been chewed away and its whole profile has been upset. So I mentioned Willard before. This is Simon Willard here, who was important in Boston clockmaking, and he and his manufactories really were the beginning of the end for the independent clockmakers in New Bedford, because they were actually churning out clocks. They had, staff and people making the cases and the movements, or importing the movements in big numbers and casing them up and selling them. So an independent guy like John Bailey in New Bedford was going to have harder and harder time competing with that too. So this is part of the end of the story. And Aaron Willard, I mentioned before, they're starting to make different, bigger versions of banjo clocks and all. And they're inexpensive, they're smaller. And, John Bailey was not going to be able to tool up and make these kinds of clocks, certainly not in a price competitive way with the Willards. So he had to turn more and more both to repairing and perhaps doing all that chronometer servicing work that was lucrative in New Bedford, until he got too many people mad at him. So the trade really of making clocks disappeared, even though the need for servicing them continued until the present time. Another nail in the coffin was Eli Terry, who invented the method for mass producing clock movements made out of wood. And the British, I mentioned, didn't like us having brass, but we had plenty of wood, and we figured out a way to mass produce them. Eli Terry took on a contract in the early 1800s to make 4,000 clock movements in 3 years, when the average clockmaker could maybe make a clock a month. So, and he succeeded, because he really was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in America. These were interchangeable parts, mass produced, and And even though Eli Whitney claimed the priority on this with his pistol mass production, his pistols all required hand finishing, filing to make them work. Long after Eli Terry was churning out thousands and thousands of these wooden clock movements, where you could just pick a part out of the bucket and put it in there, and it was going to work. So the most famous and typical type of Eli Terry early wood movement clock was a pillar and scroll clock, like you've seen here. I'm sure you're all familiar with these, and these all had wooden movements inside. So as my final image before we go into a chat session, this is of course a great Bradford view of New Bedford and whaling ships. And again, I'd love to get there again, but you certainly have a rich history in clock and watchmaking that I was happy to explore, to do this talk. I certainly was familiar with New England timekeeping, but to find your local guys and see what they were doing and read their advertisements from the early 1800s was all part of my education, and I hope now part of yours too, as you have learned a bit more about horology. Thanks very much.
Yeah, well, it certainly is education, Bob. I mean, that pretty comprehensive. I mean, the list from the reference book, there were 50 people involved in this trade.
Yeah, and that's probably not even complete. Those are the only ones they could find.
All right, so let's see. Mr. Wyman has a question. How much did the clocks sell for? Do we have any notion of that?
Sure. Yeah. And it's an important question, because one reason Willard was so successful was that before he designed and began producing banjo clocks, you really only had a few options, and none of them were good ones. If you wanted a tall clock, it could be 100 pounds back then, which you had to be quite rich. A bracket clock from London was equally expensive. So it really was only the affluent people that could afford them, or else you had a less costly wag on the wall lantern clock kind of thing, which could be cheaper, but poor timekeepers needed service a lot more because they were exposed to the air. So, but still, those could be $10, $15, $20, or pounds, which put them way beyond what anybody could afford. The banjo clocks could be in the $30 or $40 or $50 range once Willard started to produce those. So half or a third of what these much more expensive tall clocks, grandfather clocks, would cost. Once Eli Terry started pumping out the wooden works clocks, those could be $6 or $8. So suddenly the whole country could afford a clock, and they loved them. They were sold by itinerant peddlers who would leave them at your house kind of on approval, and you can be sure and come back like 2 months later, and you can be sure once that farm wife had a nice ticking clock on her mantle, despite her cheapskate husband, that clock was not leaving the house. So that was an effective strategy for the itinerant clock peddlers that roamed really the entire eastern seaboard, not just New England. Mm-hmm.
Mr. Wyman also is. So let me ask you this before we move on to his next question. So if these fellows weren't making a lot of clocks, but they were very expensive, the clocks that they made, could you make a living doing this?
No, that's why you had to sell cambrics and repair, I've seen several watchmaker clockmaker ledgers from that period, and maybe they made a clock for Mr. Big, but page after page of the ledger was cleaned watch, replaced broken watch crystal, replaced mainspring. That was their bread and butter, if they weren't also selling bread and butter.
So Mr. Wyman's next question is, how did chronometers on whaling ships change the business?
I think certainly just for the pure navigation point, it was real easy to get lost in sea and very expensive. And especially if you'd already killed a lot of whales and your ship was full of oil, your likelihood of returning home with a full hold was greatly enhanced by a chronometer. There were other methods of determining your longitude called dead reckoning, where you try to keep track of how far you'd gone and what direction you'd gone in, but highly inaccurate. and you could waste a lot of time and die out there if you missed, Pitcairn Island, where you were going to fill your water casks up again and all. So I think, broadly speaking, you were much more likely to come home alive and come home at all if you knew better where you were at sea. And the other thing too is that through word of mouth, especially as the fishery got smaller and smaller, you had to go find those whales. And if you were, the other whaling captain who returned said, find them at 48 longitude, 53 latitude, you weren't going to find that without an accurate method like a chronometer to tell you. And you also usually wanted more than one chronometer. 2 was no good because you didn't know which one was right. But 3 was preferable, and that's often the Beagle Darwin ship. They had like 22 chronometers, because they weren't taking any chances, and there was a good chance some of them would fail. But if you had at least 2 that said the same time, the odds were pretty good that that was the time.
You do see references periodically to chronometers on whale ships. They were not ubiquitous, so you didn't see them all the time. They were expensive, and these were fairly frugal Quakers. The cartography and chart making probably, no, it actually was far more advanced than the actual timekeeping itself was. So cartography and oceanic navigation had proceeded to a quite a high level, before the chronometer was even invented, and shortly thereafter it just got better year after year after year after year. And when you do look through the outfitting records, there are chronometers, but they're not on all ships.
Yeah, and the latitude was just as important. And what a lot of ships did, especially way before, was they ran the line. Once they determined their latitude, they could just follow that latitude, and they were pretty sure of where they were going.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Plus, whalers weren't going anywhere. That's another important point that especially in the 18th century, before a chronometer was even invented, these guys were whaling in the North Atlantic and along coasts. So the Straits of Belle Isle or Newfoundland or the Davis Straits, places where sort of an established line of navigation.
Yeah, I think they knew the currents and the winds and all too, that they could read the sea almost like they could read the land.
I was fascinated by your comment about old brass, and it was in I think it was in one of the Bailey ads that he was buying old brass. That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they needed the raw material, and again, the British didn't want them to have it, so they, and there isn't a whole lot of brass in a clock movement. And you can usually tell New Hampshire clock movements because there's pieces cut out of those movement plates that, weren't in important places, so that they could save brass and use it for something else.
Huh.
But, the old candlestick or something, it could go in the melting pot pretty quickly if the people didn't need it anymore.
Yeah, so those were for repairs then, for repairing.
No, that was for clockmaking. Yeah, because you didn't need much to repair. It was to make fresh parts. Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we could go on like this for a pretty long time, I think. We were lucky enough to get the clock face off the Wamsutta Mills tower. It's the original clock. I think it was from the 1850s. Not the clock itself, just the dial. So that's a pretty cool thing, and it's on exhibit, up in the Energy and Enterprise exhibit. So that's, that was another use for the time. You mentioned the Industrial Revolution, but obviously the railroads were taking it seriously, but mills were really taking it seriously, weren't they?
Yes, and that's the name of my business is Bell-Time Clocks, and that's named after a Winslow Homer engraving of Lawrence, Massachusetts. And it accompanied an article in Harper's Weekly that talked about kind of the tyranny of those mill bells. And, you know, the first one rang, you better start getting there. The second one rang, you better hustle. Third one rang, the gates shut and you lost a day's work.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Bob, this is fabulous. Thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing everything. Oh, wait, here we go. Bob DeManch has a question. Did refined whale oil play a part in this story? Sperm oil certainly did.
Yeah, hugely. One of the images I have that I really don't like showing is based on the Nye clock and watch lubrication company. And there's a big picture of all these dead blackfish lying on the beach that were going to get turned into clock and watch oil. And you can tell if an old clock or watch hasn't been serviced in a while and you open it up, you know, you're bowled over by the smell of that rancid oil, because it would go bad and it not only lose its lubricating properties, but lose the guy trying to work on it too, because it was pungent. And that was a reason why clocks and watches needed to be serviced far more frequently back then, because they were using animal-based oils, which deteriorated. You know, now we're using synthetic, you know, Mobil 1 or something like that, and it doesn't rot and go bad and smell bad. So its lubricating properties are available much longer. And that was the other thing with Harrison creating a chronometer with an escapement, a lot of the parts that didn't use oil, because he knew that out there on the shipboard, you know, that oil was going to rot, deteriorate, freeze, boil away, whatever. So the point, one of the huge advances was him creating a machine that didn't need oil in critical places, because he knew the oil would fail.
Mm-hmm.
So
Steve Burkowski out there in Provincetown.
Yeah, my friend Steve.
Yeah, hey Steve. He talks about David Stahl, you know, and you know, David Stahl was a oil refiner out in Provincetown, and he took advantage, you know, of blackfish and other small cetaceans that would beach themselves. But you know, Ezra Kelly, of course, was, in addition to being a clockmaker, was also an oil refiner as well, and sold these lubricating oils.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he could say that he used them himself as the testimonial. Mm-hmm.
Nye Oil is still in business, and they're synthetic. You know, they're over in Fairhaven. They're still in business, and they started off as, you know, as a sewing machine and watching clock oil.
Yes. Yeah, I have you know, a couple of the real old bottles. They're kind of cute looking as long as you don't take the cap off.
Well, Bob, thanks again. If I don't see any more questions in the chat, this comes to this sort of awkward part of the evening. Oh, stick around. Hopefully next month, I'm in chat with a very interesting man from England who happens to be interested in the first Chinese junk to sail from China to London as a spectacle, as a public exhibition. And there's a big story about this, and this thing actually turns up in our Russell and Purrington and Russell's grand panorama of a whaling voyage around the world. There's a painting of this junk, and so I'm in conversation with this very interesting gentleman, and so I'm going to try to round him up for November, and we can talk about the junk, the keying, and it's and how it turns up in the panorama and what its whole story is, and so that's going to be really cool. Thanks again, Bob. Like I said, it's this awkward part of the evening where you have to say goodbye and then you hit the leave button. And
yeah, I know, that's a sad time.
Thank you. It's really nice seeing you again, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Bye.